My name is Danielle Payton, and I'm a paralegal studies major. My project was on how case law and the Constitution has influenced the evolution of the death penalty in the United States. My research question, of course, was how has case law and the United States Constitution influenced the evolution of the death penalty in the United States? Now, my statement of the issue was the purpose of this project was to identify how the Constitution and case law influence the evolution of the death penalty over time. Case law sets precedents for the criminal justice system, meaning that the rulings in case law guides future cases in determining the outcome. Now to start with my background, the first recognized death penalty were laws that were found in the Code of King Hammurabi of Babylon. They dated back to 18th century BC. The Hammurabi Code prescribed the death penalty for over 20 different offenses. The first federal death penalty code was implemented in 1790. It was also known as the Crime Act of 1790. It was established by the first U.S. Congress, and it defined the crimes that constitute its use on April 30th of 1790. The first recorded execution under the newly established federal death penalty code in the United States was due to the crimes of Thomas Byrd in Portland, Maine on June 25th, 1790. Thomas Byrd was hanged for murdering the captain of a small British slave ship at sea. Now, in Pennsylvania, they have used hanging as an execution for capital punishment since the early 1600s. However, in 1834, Pennsylvania became the first state in the United States to outlaw public executions and move the gallows to county prisons instead. Moving on to the Eighth Amendment, the Eighth Amendment states, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Basically, the Eighth Amendment was more of the amendment that did define and help influence and evolve how the death penalty came to be and regulated it in a sense. It was the main amendment that regulated what was considered to be constitutional as for use. The 14th Amendment, Section 1 actually, states that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Basically, it's saying that you can execute somebody, but you do have to give them due process of law. Now, there was at a time the suspension of the death penalty. That was June 29th of 1972 when the Supreme Court of the United States effectively voided 40 death penalty statutes and suspended the death penalty. It was all due to a case called Furman versus Georgia. It was when the arbitrariness of the death penalty was again brought up before the Supreme Court. Therefore, the death penalty was not really suspended. It was basically just put on hold until further notice. Up until the reinstatement, of course, due to cases collectively known as the Gregg decision, which was the landmark decision that held that the new death penalty statutes in Florida, Georgia, and Texas were constitutional and therefore reinstating the death penalty in those particular states. However, the court also held that the death penalty itself was constitutional under the Eighth Amendment and reinstated its use nationwide. The court held that executing... My bad, I got ahead of myself. Continuing on with background, there was this case called Penry versus Linoff, I think that's how you pronounce it, where the court held that executing mentally retarded people convicted of capital offenses is not categorically prohibited by the Eighth Amendment, meaning that it was at first seen constitutional to execute the mentally ill in America. However, the following case, Atkins, it was Atkins versus Virginia is the full case name, it held that the executions of mentally retarded criminals were prohibited by the Eighth Amendment, therefore abrogating Penry versus Linoff, meaning that, over time, because Penry was a case that I believe was decided in the 1970s. I don't have my notes on me, but later on, Atkins was a case decided in 1989, and the court decided that, what, we were wrong originally. It's definitely not okay to execute the mentally ill. Moving on to the Stanford case, which was Stanford versus Kentucky. That was a case where Stanford was convicted of murder, first-degree sodomy, first-degree robbery, and receiving stolen property, and was sentenced to death as well as 45 years in prison by the district court. Of course, when he appealed and brought it to the Supreme Court of Kentucky, they affirmed the ruling. So that was the case that decided that, okay, yeah, you can execute minors below the age of 18. No problem. Of course, then, in Roper versus Simmons, that changed yet again. And Roper versus Simmons is where Christopher Simmons was charged with burglary, kidnapping, stealing, and murder in the first degree. And he was tried as an adult, which the state sought the death penalty. He was 17 at the time he committed the crime, but the reason why they tried him as an adult is because he turned 18, I believe, while he was in holding. So the Supreme Court held that the execution of individuals who were under the age of 18 at the time of their capital crimes is prohibited by the 8th and 14th Amendments combined, and therefore it abrogated Stanford versus Kentucky, which Stanford was also a 1989 case. The Roper versus Simmons case later on was happening in the year of 2005. Currently now, a total of 19 states, as well as the District of Columbia, have outlawed the death penalty. 31 states, including the U.S. government and the U.S. military, however, still utilize the death penalty as capital punishment, and 4 states utilize, I'm probably going to say this really, really wrong, gubernatorial moratoria, which is basically when the state governor will use their authority to commute all death sentences to something like life in prison instead. And also, as of July 1st of 2017, there's a total of 2,817 inmates on death row, collectively in the United States. Now, for my solution, proposal, and budget narrative, part of my assignment, the common concern, there was always the argument as to whether or not it was more cost-effective to execute death row inmates or keep them alive and in prison for life. This is all thought of by the people because prison costs are typically paid for by the taxpayers' money, and therefore they have the right to know if the government, whether federal or local, is wisely and effectively using the money they're collecting. Currently, there are 186 inmates on death row in the state of Pennsylvania, and it costs about $45,000 per year per inmate. That approximately a year for the number of inmates on death row for just sleeping, eating, and having a roof over their head. It doesn't actually include the cost of the method of execution, the tools, the location, etc., is about $8,370,000. Meanwhile, an inmate to stay incarcerated for life in prison is about $178,500,000 a year. But that's also growing considering crime, happens daily and people are sent to prison daily. Therefore, the costs of imprisonment for taxpayers just goes up. But believe it or not, which is better, it's cheaper to imprison inmates for life rather than execute them. Tens of $millions cheaper, in fact. Yes, an execution in Pennsylvania has not actually happened since 1999. And therefore, technically, I guess it is more expensive to put inmates in prison for life because, as I said, it's continuously growing. But if executions were to get a move on due to the quickening of the appeals process, this is, of course, speaking hypothetically, and Pennsylvania executed just 10 people this year, then the total cost of capital punishment would estimate to be around $2,720,450,000 for 2018 alone. Now, there are concerns, though, of if we end capital punishment, and it's mainly just, if we get rid of the death penalty, of course, taxpayers would save a good bit of money, but it would also cause a lot of victims' families to continue to suffer, in a sense. basically, like, no one would really have closure, and closure being they wouldn't see justice in their eyes, like the eye for an eye type saying. Some families do believe in that, because they'll be left with the thought that, like, basically their family member is dead or never going to be the same again, while the criminal gets to continue to live behind bars or not. And then another concern that people will most definitely have if the death penalty is brought to an end is that without the death penalty, some criminals would continue to commit crimes. The death penalty is known to deter prisoners who are already serving life sentences in jail from committing more serious offenses. Common sense tells us that the most frightening thing for a human being is to lose their life. Therefore, the death penalty is the best deterrent when it comes to discouraging people from carrying out the worst crimes. Moving on to the multicultural awareness portion, a little bit shorter. Who is more likely to receive the death penalty? As most people would think, sad to say, the color of someone's skin, whether the defendant or the victim, plays a crucial role as well as an unacceptable role in determining who will receive the death penalty. Pennsylvania is actually the 5th highest state, with 70% of its inmates on death row being minorities. In January of 2003, researchers at the University of Maryland concluded in a study commissioned by the Maryland governor that defendants are much more likely to be sentenced to death if they have killed a white person. That was actually very shocking to find out, I won't lie. And then there are some ways to stop that. There's not many. It is a little bit more difficult to stop racial bias in the court systems. But ways to begin to reduce it, like the prevalence of racial disparity in the criminal justice system would be for like practices such as outlawing the racial profiling that is occasionally done by police. You can strengthen civilian review and control of local police departments, decriminalize more nonviolent drug offenses like the use of marijuana. Obviously, that's probably the only one that's could be decriminalized because it's the only drug that has been known to not necessarily cause harmful or negative side effects or anything like that. We could also reform bail policies to make release for nonviolent offenders the default, as well as reducing or eliminating the requirement of cash bail and, of course, much more. Now, my conclusion is on the screen. It says the death penalty is loved and hated all over the nation. It's just like every other legal aspect, which is questioned by some and accepted by some at the same time. It's something you just kind of have to take it as it comes, take it as it goes. The world will never know if it comes to an end or not. Well, the world will know, but only the future can tell. That's really all you can say about that. But that is my entire capstone presentation.